Thanks everyone for joining us today. As you know, today's Board Open Forum is on board diversity, and this open forum is taken out of the process that was going on in the Governance Reform Working Group, and we'd like to take this opportunity to thank the two chairs of the working group, Hans-Peter Dettler and George Sadowski, for their work, and to thank the members of the working group for putting in the efforts to comment over the course of time that brought us to the most recent report. One of the issues that bubbled up to the top throughout that process, and I think has been an ongoing concern, is the issue of board diversity. And that's why it's the topic of our first sequence of conversations. There was one of these earlier today. The recording for that will be available. So if you'd like to review the comments from your colleagues from the earlier session, that's one way to do that. Next slide, please. There are a couple of housekeeping rules for today. We ask everybody who speaks today to please respect the code of conduct for individual members of the Internet Society. I'll note that simultaneous interpretation will be available in English, French, and Spanish, and that closed captions are available in English. You can select these options in the Zoom panel, and the next slide will actually show you where that is in case you're not familiar with those controls. We do ask that if you're not speaking, to please keep your microphone on mute at all times. You can use the chat for questions. If you do so, please keep your questions brief and to the point, and format that with your first name and country. E.g., in my case, it would be Ted, Portugal. You can type the questions into chat in French or Spanish. Those will be translated and sent to the chair. And the session will be recorded, and a link for future viewing will be shared after the call. Also, if you'd like to make an intervention in French or Spanish, please feel free to do that, and we will have one of the translators then translate the substance of your intervention to the rest of the team. Next slide, please. This shows where on the Zoom panel you can see the live transcript, which is the closed captioning, and where you will see the related translations. Next slide, please. This is the agenda for today. We're currently in the welcome and introduction portion of it. The next, I'll do a quick reminder of the constraints under which the Governance Reform Working Group Charter was operated, and those same constraints apply to the set of proposals that we can discuss today, and a couple of additional housekeeping remarks. The rest of the time will be essentially an open forum for member comments and questions. After we reach the close of time, we'll then have just a couple of closing remarks. And so here are the constraints under which the Internet Society's Governance Reform Working Group operated. And for those who are listening, it's consistent with the Internet Society's origin and mission statement and its incorporation documents. The proposals considered by this working group will not include proposals to reduce stakeholder communities' ability to choose candidates to serve on the Board of Trustees, or proposals that would require relocation or dissolution of the Internet Society as it is currently incorporated in the United States. In addition, this working group will not consider proposals that would breach or negate current legal relationships and agreements between the Internet Society and ICANN, or between the Internet Society and the Public Interest Registry. Thanks very much. Okay, I think for an additional housekeeping remarks, I just wanted to make sure everybody knew that if they enter anything into the chat, for those who are listening rather than able to follow the chat, I will be speaking those aloud if it is possible to do so. I will note in the first one, Luis managed to paste into the chat a long series of very valuable resources, which were a little bit too long for me to actually read aloud, but we'll make available in some other form. And with that, we are now turning over to discussion. Feel free to raise your hand using the Zoom tool if you'd like to speak, or to once again enter something into the chat, and we'll move from there. Hi, Dave. Dave, you appear to be muted. Can you check your local mute?
Is that better?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Thanks. The question is how we can make some of this make a difference to what the internet society is in the real world today. In particular, there's nothing wrong with diversity, but the whole point of diversity is to change the substance of what the organization does. How can we make sure that the goals we have of being an open, transparent, what some people call multi-stakeholder organization, are actually imposed on the organization, which in reality is a top-down, thoroughly controlled, overwhelmingly US and European organization that, for example, does little or nothing about the problem of control of the internet by a handful of giants. Remember, 2/3 of the internet is not in the global north. India has more people on the internet than the US and Western Europe combined. China is bigger than India. And I'm very glad to see that somebody who's Chinese has finally been allowed in. But we certainly haven't incorporated the desires of the global South in the policies of the internet society. How do we change that? Will the board be active enough to make a difference, or will they continue to deferring to a handful of people at the top of the staff?
So just as a reminder, today's topic is board diversity. And as you started out by saying, a big question is whether board diversity is enough to address those. And leaving that question on the table for later discussion, I guess my question to you is, what do you think board diversity can do to contribute to making sure that the society serves the full constituency of those who either use the internet or who would like to?
Is that a question to me?
Yes.
Okay. First, the Internet Society traditionally, and I've been active for over a decade, has been run at the top by staff. Many of us think that the chapters, which are far more diverse, the majority of which in the global South, should be playing a much more active role. As we know, the board decided to avoid funding the chapters, despite the unanimous recommendation from the chapters committee, and that the first thing that we can do to change how the Internet Society works is to strengthen the chapters by providing them a minimal amount of money. We were talking about 3% rising to 10% of the budget, that the chapters would control how it's spent and what it's done, as long as it's consistent with the basics of the Internet Society.
So, David, this is useful history, but the topic of today's set of interventions is board diversity. Can you focus on how board diversity helps?
Yeah, board diversity can stop the nature of the Internet Society of being a closed group of people who overwhelmingly were American and European, who only who make decision after decision that ignores the global South, the chapters as the major tool for which the Internet Society can transform itself, and the desires and needs of people who don't reflect the previous board. So, for example, we should have 2 or 3 of the board members who do not reflect our goal of diversity voluntarily resign and expect that our constituencies will go out and reach out to people who think differently and not necessarily look differently, although that's the way it usually turns out. So the board diversity is not nearly enough. It's not enough because we keep putting the same kind of people or people who agree with them on the board. And we should change that immediately by the powers that be persuading several board members who are contributing very little publicly to step aside in favor of people who want change in the substance of the Internet society beyond the color of their face.
Okay, Richard, you're next.
Thank you. If I may, I would prefer to defer first to Veni, who did most of the work on this in the report that went to the board, and then I'll come in right after Veni, if that's okay with both you and Veni. Thank you.
Okay, Veni.
Trying to unmute myself. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Oh, well, thanks for organizing this, and this is really good for I think Istock and the global Istock community. I'm also not sure, did you, I mean, anyway, this is a technical issue, I'll put it in the chat, but on the questions, the Internet Society Board of Trustees could become more diverse, and this could be achieved easily by implementing some changes in the bylaws, which will require that such diversity be achieved by all the organizations that are electing chapter trustees. Yes, it's not the ideal situation, given the fact that, you know, the different election, the different groups, the different organizational groups are electing different trustees, and there will be probably some way of, you know, working through the fact that at some point there may be a little bit more from one group and a little bit less from the other, but overall, if we look at the composition of the board within, let's say, 3 years, which is the usual term of board trustees, there should be some balance between geographic, gender diversity, and that would make the Internet Society stronger. It will make the organization to look more like the members that it has, and it will also hopefully will change a little bit the focus of the organization, which even though it's based in the US, which is obvious and for historic reasons, has long time ago became an international organization that has outreach to hundreds of countries around the world.
Thank you. Before turning to Richard, I will drain the queue of comments that are in the chat, because these sort of came in while Benny was talking. Glenn noted board diversity should reflect the ISOC motto of the Internet for everyone. Currently, we don't see representation as reflected in this motto. Glenn McKnight goes on, most boards realize that diversity and gender balance on boards adds value and perspective to issues. Arthur Wagwaga said, how will the board diversity take into account the needs of the members who aren't attached to one particular country? Roaming stars. I propose a structure that on the one hand takes regional balance, but on the other hand, what one brings to the board regardless of regional affiliation. Glenn goes on, the challenge for this committee is a balanced approach to creating equitable diversity. Stephen Farrell commented in regards to Benny's comment, achieved easily seems optimistic, and Richard Hill replied, I disagree, it has worked fine for the check. Stephen Farrell asks, interesting, is that documented somewhere? I mean, the process followed before and after it starts. There's a link placed in that to the relevant document, which I believe are the check statutes. And Glenn also put in a link to something at hbr.org, when and why diversity improves your board's performance. I think that drains that queue. Richard, you're next. Great,
thanks. Well, yeah, first I'm surprised that we're even asking the question, should we be more diverse? Does more diversity help, etc. I think this is, as Glenn McKnight has correctly pointed out, this is well understood. This is not debatable anymore. So the question should be how to achieve greater diversity in the ISOC board, because as Vinny and everybody can tell, it's not actually as diverse as it could be. So various people have said that's very difficult to implement. I have consistently pointed out that it's worked very well for the Chapters Advisory Council. And in fact, Joyce posted the details on the list so everybody can see how that works. There is a possibility that sometimes it wouldn't work. Yeah, it's true. It's a quota system. There's no miracles. You know, if you want to force diversity, you have to do quotas. So if you're against quotas, then forget it. But I think it's well understood that the disadvantages of quotas are far outweighed by the benefits of diversity. So some massaging or variation of the Chapters Advisory Council mechanism, I think, would work very well for Istock. It's worked fine for the Chapters Advisory Council. Why wouldn't it work for the board? Yeah, okay, Stephen, I agree. It's not entirely clear. I think Joyce would be the best qualified person to speak on it because she has followed all the elections and knows exactly what's going on. And then I'm going to abuse my speaking time for a couple minutes to go on a topic that is definitely not within scope. I recognize that, but that's
Please don't do that, Richard. Richard, this is a focused conversation. Please don't abuse your position.
Well, it's related to that. I think at some point we need to open the discussion of whether the IETF should actually have members on the board, because I think that's an obvious conflict of interest. So I think the board should reopen
that is out of scope. It was out of scope for the governance working group, as I read at the beginning of this, and it is out of scope for today's discussion. So the next speaker is Martha.
Hold on a minute. Ted Hardy, who represents the things that we're working to change, should not be telling other people what they shouldn't say. And
I'm not saying you shouldn't say it.
No,
I'm saying today's meeting is not about that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And
Ted
Dave,
Hardy
please,
should
let's
step aside and no longer
let's please keep the
meeting.
conversation. No, that's not correct. Let's keep the conversation focused, please.
And it is now Martha's turn, Dave, not yours. You're very, very.
Can you speak
faint.
louder? We can't hear you.
Hear me better now? Yeah, amazing. Greetings from Nigeria. My internet is a little bit shaky. I'm really delightful and super thrilled to have these sessions with you. I'm a little bit baffled about the theme though, because I think that as Dave and maybe a few others have touched upon, as a woman and a big supporter of diversity, I think that inclusion and representing the members is very important when discussing the role of the board. And I think that it's very important to include new members and new supporters. And I feel like maybe that discussion on how to be more inclusive and also represent the membership in itself might be relevant for this. And I'm sorry if I'm speaking on top of anyone. I just joined a little bit late. That's all.
Thank you for your comments. There are a number of comments in the chat, putting aside those which are about connection issues. I think diversity is a critical issue, especially taking into account the realities and the opinions that are different. Fanny goes on, it's good to see so many people connected to today's call. Arthur, although numerical / the board should balance substantive representation in contrast to descriptive representation, let's avoid formal descriptive representation without substance. In my view, I may be wrong, tend to follow formal representation that lacks substance, and this can be prone to self-interest and politicization of inclusion. And Glenn says you can slice and dice diversity beyond strict ethnicity and gender to consider the issue of people with poverty, older adults, people with disabilities, etc. Nancy Ray's reply to that. Exactly, and Mohammed, your hand is up.
Thanks everyone, Mohammed Shabir from Pakistan. The question that Richard asked is appropriate, and at the very point that we are having this session signifies that the board recognizes the need for diversity at the board. The question that we are asking and we have been searching answer for is that how do we achieve that diversity? What are the strategies? What could be the options? What could be the constraints? So my request to the members here would be to give us some suggestions that how do we achieve that diversity. Richard has so kindly pointed out one option, CHAC, Chapter Advisory Council option. Whether we, if someone has any objections or any ideas that can build upon it, or if there are any observations onto that, I would as a member of the board, would welcome those. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll point out from our first conversation earlier today, George Sadowski went through with the group how increasing the diversity of the NOMCOM helped increase the diversity of the candidate pool that the NOMCOM was then able to present to the organizational members and the chapter members, because the more diverse NOMCOM, the appropriate connections into different communities to bring forward candidates that might not have been available had it just been the existing board members who provided the NOMCOM. So after Luis comments, perhaps George would explain that to this group. Luis?
Thank you, Ted. Hi, everybody. Well, I would like to point out that it's very interesting how these calls for diversity comes from the North, if we want to divide the world that way. But there is a lack of presence in this conversation of people from the South or the global South. Well, first, I'm coming from the global South, yes, from Mexico, and I actually live in North America. So I will call everybody to avoid this distinction of the global North and the global South, because people on the global South, as being called so, we feel divided from the rest of the world, and we are a single world. So that's one point. And the other point is maybe Veni said about that should reflect what the internet society is. And we should take a look into how the membership is comprised. There are places where there is no presence of the internet society. So there is a restriction from the origin of how people may participate if there is no presence there. Okay. Also, I will invite people to look at the numbers from the telecommunications industry and how it's comprised in terms of gender. Yes, and in practical terms, the balance or the parity that many organizations call is hard to achieve, because the tendency in telecommunications industry is clearly unbalanced. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Just beforehand, I'm going to drain the queue of chat comments and then turn to you. In comments replying to Glenn's previous intervention on consider the issue of people with property, older adults, people with disabilities, Nancy Reyes and Stephen Farrell said exactly and +1. Richard Hill replied that I think that we should focus on geographic and gender diversity at this stage. Nancy Reyes said that would be exclusion. Glenn McKnight replied, if we open the door on equality, we can't limit it. Peter Koch replied, increased compliance rules are likely to favor big tech. Nancy Reyes replied, why that is more important. You will get people with disabilities in all of those groups. Veni replied, there are some largely and widely accepted diversity principles. The fact that the governance group included these in the outcome, the number of folks on today's call, this and the one earlier, is a sign that it's a hot topic. If the board doesn't address it, it will mean that the board of trustees believes that it's not a problem and that this problem on its own, but a different one. Richard replied, why only geographic and gender, and why not add persons with disabilities? Andrew made a comment that I noticed in the discussion that some people were framing board membership in terms of representing some constituency. It's important to remember that as a legal matter, the board isn't a parliament, and the trustees once appointed have a duty to the Internet Society and are not representatives, they're appointing constituency. Richard Hill included a pointer to the CHAC rules. Serge Parfait Goma said, sorry, could I have that translated, please? Richard Barnes said, yes, as Andrew says, board members have fiduciary duties to the Internet Society, in particular as a duty of loyalty that requires them to put the interests of the society above any competing interest. Olivier, we can use a declaration of engagement of all stakeholders and shareholders too. Glenn replied, bringing in reps from the global South that are part of the privileged elite isn't diversity. Joyce provided the translation. I have to admit that a lot has evolved over the past years. In the past, translation was a problem, but is now much better organized. Thank you for that. Stephen Farrell replied to Glenn, that's a concern I share, albeit now I'm now knowledgeable. Nancy Reyes noted, if you focus on one group, geographic or gender, to the exclusion of everyone else, including people with disabilities, elderly, and other vulnerable groups. Only if you focus on all diversity is real diversity. Plus, you will find an overlap in all groups. You could have a woman with disability, elderly, and poor economy. Laura Thompson replied to Glenn, I agree. Laura from Australia, resident in the USA. I don't believe we're representative in the Global South for the reason you mentioned. And Dave Burson said, we should not be looking at the superficial presentation of a board, but the substance of what they are and do. George, now you.
Thanks. 3 points quickly. First of all, recognize that the process of selecting board members is a two-step process. The NOMCOM prepares slates based on recommendations and nominations, and the individual constituencies vote. So the NOMCOM has a limited, certainly has some control over who the board members are likely to be, but it's limited by the fact that we don't actually choose them, unlike I can. Second, the NOMCOM's duty, first of all, the NOMCOM is composed of at least one person from that the organization members recommend and one person that the chapters recommend. The rest of the NOMCOM is really up for grabs. And as chair of the NOMCOM in the last 2 years, I interpret that to mean that we should put people on the NOMCOM that have networks independent of, pardon me, that have social and professional networks that are independent of what we already have. There are good candidates for the board everywhere, and our job is to ferret them out in ways that places we ordinarily don't look at. And third, my own interpretation of diversity is that we're looking for people and cultures that see the world in different ways so that we get all perspectives. They're obviously correlated with gender, they're correlated with nationality, where you were brought up, with what society you were brought up in. But it's the different ways of looking at the world and the different needs that people have that have driven my own thinking regarding the composition of the NOMCOM. Thank you.
Thank you. There's additional comments. Judith Hellerston, thanks for reading out the chat, as it helps people who may have cognitive disabilities take part and get their points across. +1 to George. Serge also said, thank you to George, and Richard Hill said, I agree with George. Kevin, Glenn McKnight asked to post the agenda again. We're still in the discussion portion of the agenda, and I anticipate that we'll stay here for at least the next 25 minutes. Richard Hill?
Well, since I've seen some support for what George said, maybe you could ask whether anybody disagrees with what George said. And if nobody disagrees with what George said, then I think we would have an important step forward. And even an outline on how to go about tackling it.
Well, so as I understand, and George, feel free to chime in here, what he's suggesting is that the mechanism that he was using as the chair of the NOMCOM should be part of the pattern going forward. Is that correct?
Well, that makes sense to me, but it's really up to the NOMCOM chair to decide how to interpret his or her mandate in this case, in completing the NOMCOM membership.
I think what Richard is suggesting, that it should be made an expectation that part of that mandate is that the NOMCOM itself should be diverse. Am I interpreting you correctly, Richard? Okay, thank you. That's valuable feedback.
You're muted, Ted.
Ted, I think you're
Oh,
muted.
sorry. Thank you. I was trying to read out the chat and was still muted there. So going back to where it was before, Kevin posted the agenda as requested by Glenn Knight. John Moore said, I agree with George. Glenn McKnight said, thanks to Kevin, and Sean Turner complimented Kevin for being on the ball. Dave Burstein said, we are all here because we believe the Internet Society can do much more. We should address substance, not appearance. Peng Hu said, I agree with George. As Dave Burstein said, +1. The translation of Serge Parfait's is, it is actually how we see the world that should be the basis of our community. Glenn McKnight said, how diverse is the ISOC NOMCOM? And John Moore said, diversity should be a NOMCOM mandate. I think it's important for us as we consider mandates to discuss a little bit more in depth what types of diversity are being addressed. There was a good bit of commentary in the chat window that went back and forth on whether gender and geographic diversity were the only items to be considered, or whether there were other types of diversity to consider and what those might be. So if folks would like to comment on that in addition, that would be useful. Ron?
Yeah, thank you, Ted. Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, wherever you might be. I guess I was going to respond a little bit about the pipeline before George commented on the approach he's taken the last couple of years on the NOMCOM, because I think the important piece here, to achieve, Glenn, like some of the diversity you're indicating is pretty wide, the breadth of how many different diverse characteristics you want to identify. But to achieve those kind of things, it's all about how do you make sure you've got a good pipeline. And I think what George was describing is having members of the NOMCOM with diverse networks, diverse backgrounds. That kind of gives you a good sense of having diverse skill sets complemented with diverse backgrounds and perspectives. I think that's a good thing. But one thing I was going to raise is, if you try to take those two things together, one, make sure you've got a good NOMCOM process to get a good diverse set of candidates. But then two, what happens when that diverse set isn't sufficient? It doesn't meet this broader diversity goals that you're trying to achieve, because even with a broad set of networks, there still isn't sufficient skill sets. Maybe you find somebody with certain characteristics that you're identifying as your diverse objectives, but they don't have the governance background, the business acumen, or the fiduciary expertise to be an effective board member. So perhaps there's a complementary thing here in the nominating process, where if candidates are found that meet some of the diversity needs, but don't have the experience or the ability to come in as a full member with the governance expertise, have an associate or developmental or a way of identifying candidates that maybe hit your diversity goals, but also have some sort of associate director path to be able to equip them and enable them. That way, you've got another way of feeding into the pipeline to meet your objectives, and also to have sort of achieve that broad diversity approach. So that's my thought.
Thank you for sharing it. George, I'm going to once again go to the chat and read through the chat before we move to you. In response to John Moore's diversity should be a non-con mandate, Lee McKnight says, practically speaking, this is a solved problem for many other organizations, with the only unique aspect for ISOC being how late it is to focus on DEAI at the board level. My suggestion, ISOC hired DEAI board consultants to prepare suggested country tweaks to the process that are then put forward back to the community for adoption by X date. George says, board reform should not just address increasing the representation of the underrepresented within the current rules, but an option to reform and justify the rules. I agree on the elites issue raised by a colleague, but I believe in procedures that accords opportunities to all regardless of their status. Inclusion based on one status alone may turn out to be paternalistic on the one hand, and on the other hand, disadvantage the so-called elites, who may not be elites, but poor people who worked hard to be where they are. Sean Turner posted the composition of the ISOC NOMCOM. Glenn McKnight says, my experience with ISOC NOMCOM, that diversity wasn't the case. Stephen Farrell says, I'd be happy if the board came back with a plan for handling this input and the other time zone diversity session, for that to be reviewed by a similar session in a few months. Sean Turner replied to Glenn McKnight, as we both know, it's hard to get people to serve. Richard Hill supported Lee's suggestion. Glenn McKnight said, yes, it is tough for sure, but the extra work is worth it. Richard Barnes claiming that DEI is solved in any context seems optimistic. Glenn McKnight said that Lee and myself are two different McKnights. Laura said, agreed, Richard, the nomination and election aspects make it more challenging here, but I would like for us to do better. George and then Richard.
Yeah, thanks. The problem here from I think from an engineering point of view is that you have a vastly over-constrained problem. And that comes up when you're looking for axes of diversity. The more axes you have, the more you're not going to be able to fulfill them, because you're looking for a few people, and you're not even choosing them as the nom-com, and the elections are independent, so that the ability to satisfy all of these constraints it's simply not there, and that's why I think I retreat more to a culture and diverse points of view, a set of axes where a lot of things are rolled in together as a way to try to satisfy a diversity requirement that can't be explicitly stated. Thanks.
Richard? Richard?
All right, I accidentally locked myself out of my mute button for a moment. So yeah, George, thanks for that. I think thanks, George, for bringing up this kind of broad kind of background and viewpoint-based notion of diversity, which I think is a really useful one because it captures the high level of objective of a lot of different diversity metrics. The challenging thing I'll point out about that is that that's a difficult thing to capture in any sort of quantitative measurable sense, and so it makes any sort of hard, if you were going to do hard definitions or quotas or anything, like it doesn't really map to that notion of diversity. So I just wanted to kind of call out that tension there between those potential inclinations. Also wanted to comment on Ron's point about a pipeline. Thank you for bringing that up, Ron. I think that's probably a vein that would be productive to explore. I think there's useful work that could be done there, and sort of developing more people, developing a deeper pipeline of folks with different backgrounds that are well suited to serve on the board. A point that came up in the call earlier today, UTC, was a notion of skill set diversity, making sure we have a right, folks looking at this from the right professional backgrounds, have the right composition of skills on the board. And I think that's, that feeds into this as well, making sure that we have folks with the right backgrounds, as you said, in kind of governance, potentially legal issues, accounting issues, community management issues, the needs of various parts of the world, coming onto the board. So I think that fits very well into this notion of pipeline. And I think that in looking forward a bit to where we might find some action items here, I think building up that pipeline, building up some infrastructure to support that pipeline could be an area where there's some good actions to be taken.
Thank you, Arthur, and then I'll drain the queue of chat.
Hello, I'm Arthur at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Then I agree with the previous speaker, because within, I think, let me just give an example within the ethics, AI ethics field where I'm currently working. You see that I think what we do is we talk of diversity in terms of disciplines, but within the disciplines we talk of the skill sets as well, and then culture. I'm not the sort of person who believes in geographic representation for the sake of geographic representation without an evidence base on why we are doing that. Because at the end of the day, it's not so much about formal representation, but about substance. So if a person from sub-Saharan Africa, where I come from, wants to be on the board, then they have to prove that in addition to being from Southern Africa, this is what I'm bringing to the board. Within the non-com in ICANN, sometimes I'm afraid to say this, it can be such a circus where people are vying for positions, and I sort of wonder And then you see the same people being recycled year in, year out, because they've got connections inside. But what's also important is to keep the old board members who have got institutional history, because they've got the wisdom, they know where we are coming from, until such a time the new board members know exactly what they are doing. Thank you.
Thank you. And just before going on to the next speaker, I'll read out where we are in the chat. Vinny says, I can't express strongly enough how such issues which could be solved are being kicked down the road without being addressed or solved. The current effort, more substantive, thanks to two co-chairs and all involved, is perhaps the last one to attract such attention and participation. If the Board of Trustees dismisses the outcome and proposed solutions, I don't see how Istock.org could continue to believe that it really listens to the chapters who brought the diversity issue in focus, and will confirm some of the Istock members' comments that the org members and the IETF are actually having agenda that does not take into account the chapters and individual members' interests. Stephen Farrell, one aspect not yet mentioned, be good if part of the outcome here were for the Board of Trustees to tell the IEB what kinds of diversity would be desirable in their picks. It'll be hard on that side to meet such an ask, but good to get it asked, in my opinion. John Moore says, one problem seems to be that there are too few numbers of trustees to meet all of the diversity desires in the same board. Lee McKnight says, note that I claimed only that boards have addressed increased DEI systematically for years, with, yes, professional consultants, assistants, who then suggested structural reforms of various types. Not a magic bullet, but a process started elsewhere much earlier. Richard Hill says, I agree with Benny, and responds to Lee, indeed, perfection is not possible, but that's not a reason to try to improve diversity. Andrew Sullivan, I have some practical questions for the quota approach that seem important to face. Suppose we have hard requirements over multiple years and we don't meet the target. What rule would be acceptable to put in place? Could the board or bylaws require that, say, a given constituency chosen appointee must meet certain qualifications? Would it be acceptable to reject the appointee in the case where the appointee didn't meet the target? How many times and for how long? I don't have an opinion about this, to be clear. It just seems something that would need to be addressed. John Moore says, one skill needed is experience with running an organization with chapters. That should be an activist. Something I have been pushing for years, getting better, but ISOC still does not make full use of its chapters. Stephen Farrell, for what it's worth, a strict quota outcome would be a bad outcome in my opinion. Richard Hill, responding to Andrew, yes, all those issues need to be addressed, but the fact that they are complex issues does not justify not trying to find ways to increase diversity. Andrew says, I agree with Stephen F. June replies, then you need apprenticeship. Andrew Sullivan replies to Richard, no, I'm not arguing that we shouldn't find such ways. I'm trying to ask how to do it. Richard replies to Andrew, my suggestion is to start with the CHAC scheme and refine it. That's in parallel to George's suggestion for greater diversity in the non-com. Sean Turner, I have to point out that greater diversity in the non-com isn't exactly a new thing. That has been tried. Andrew replies to Richard, the obvious difference is that if the CHAC doesn't have a quorum, there's no legal problem. The next speaker is Wisdom.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Wisdom Donko, and I'm speaking from Ghana. Yes, I just want to add up to where Atta left off. There is one particular issue that I think needs to be looked at if we want ISOC at the grassroots level to strive. The issue has been that sometimes when an executive term expires, I don't know, within African context, I think it happens in several countries. And when an executive term expires, sometimes they deliberately don't announce the process to begin to elect new executives. They can sometimes wait 6 months after their term has expired, sometimes 1 year after their term has expired, before they begin the process to kind of elect new executive. I think that doesn't help, and then it's not bringing the diversity that we're all talking about. So this is something that we need to look at critically and see how this can be addressed from the top so that some of these things can stop happening. So this is my little contribution I have to make.
Thank you for your contribution. From the chat, Benny, to Andrew Sullivan's rejection of appointee, there will be no rejection if the org members, IETF, and NOMCOM are following the newly changed bylaws. Benny, sure, but as a legal matter, we have to have bylaws that we can conform to. And if we don't, as a compliance matter, we need to have a story about how we can get back in compliance with our bylaws. So I'll point out that one of the interesting things about diversity is that there are all kinds of axes, and one of them is time zone diversity. Earlier today, we had a previous set of discussions, and one of the big topics in that set of discussions actually hasn't occurred here at all. So I'll bring it up now, which is in that discussion, people were talking about the board using its power, which it currently has under the bylaws, to appoint new members as one way of addressing, at least in the short term, diversity issues. The consequences of that would be, one, each person appointed by the board is a full member and has a 3-year term. So it would probably be effective only where we're sure that the particular element of diversity could not be otherwise addressed, or would at least last through that 3-year period. And two, it raises the size of the board. And this was a point that was made earlier in the chat, that people wonder whether it's easy to get all of these axes of diversity in a board this size. Frankly speaking, this is actually quite a large board, and because it has the mechanisms of turnover that it does, it turns over relatively rapidly compared to other boards, because it's not self-sustaining, and each individual constituency needs to replace whenever somebody is termed out, and may replace earlier than that. There's a good bit of change that can occur in the board in any particular year, and the succession of boards can be significantly different. So I do wonder if the people on today's meeting have any thought about the board using its capability under the current bylaws to make appointments to increase diversity, and what your thoughts might be. But I see that Benny actually joined the queue before I made that comment, so his comment may be on a different topic. Benny?
I can talk on any topic that you have raised in the meantime. But yes, it was a different topic in response to Andrew's comment in the chat about where he says as a legal matter, we have to have bylaws that we can conform to. And if we don't, as a compliance matter, we need to have a story about how we can get back in compliance with our bylaws. But I think one of the ways to approach this will be, and that's why I mentioned in the beginning, instead of looking into every year, we look at every 2 or 3 years, so that there is a diversity on the board on an average on every 2 or 3 years, not in a particular year. Because, for example, this year there may be, and I'm making this up, you know, out of 10 board members, 6 are from one part of the world, 4 are from the other, but next year it could be 5 to 5, the year after that could be 4 to 6. So on an average, it will be 5 to 5. So that's one thing that should be looked into. And then the second thing is all the organizational members and chapters who are, and the IETF who are appointing and electing board members, they could actually, once they know the bylaws are going to change next year, for example, or are changing this year but will take in effect next year, they could then, instead of thinking, oh, they're not going to elect or they're not going to appoint board members who are diverse, they will know that they have to. They will know if they supposedly they send, you know, out of the 4 members they are supposed to elect, they send 4 Americans. Well, sorry, but that won't be acceptable because it's not in accordance with the bylaws. So they're gonna break the bylaws, not the organization. And yeah, I think on that subject I'll stop, and then somebody else may respond to your other question.
From the chat, we see Arthur, I agree on the bylaws use, provided it is not arbitrary. Using bylaws will help you to capture non-paradigmatic members who may be qualified but have no strong regional affiliation. John Moore replies, good solution, Benny, several years of diversity. Stephen Farrell says, with regard to Board of Trustees adding members themselves, I'd be okay if the Board of Trustees were to first consult with the community as to what kind of diversity gap the Board of Trustees was aiming to close, and so long as it wasn't an uncommon process. Andrew Sullivan, but it doesn't answer the question I asked, which is what we can do in the event some constituency doesn't appoint the required diversity. To take one comment from Stephen, I believe that the community has already identified gender diversity as a long-standing issue with the board. And I think we could say, for example, that if the Board of Trustees were to consider making an appointment, it would definitely want to address the gender diversity issue as one of the ones it addressed by making such an appointment. I think that's relatively clear. There are other axes that have been raised. Mohammed has raised the disability axis. A number of people have raised the geographic axis. So there's axis. And so there are a number of different ways we might consider it. But I think that the key issue is whether or not, if the board were to do that, would it be by a call to the community and to say, for example, we are looking specifically for a candidate to appoint to the board who has the following characteristic? Would it be from the ones that the board already knew? And if it were to happen, which board would do it? Would it be the board that receives the information about the incoming board members and therefore knows what the board makeup will be in the following board? Or would it be the board that has a particular composition and then must make a choice to adjust that composition itself? So there's a number of mechanical questions there as well. George, there are a couple of comments here. I'll take those and then to you. Richard Barnes, I might be willing to agree that some harder rules would be a good idea, but the bylaws are not the right place to put them. They're too hard. It would mean that if we couldn't find a good candidate that fits the constraints in a given year, we'd be legally compelled to put in a bad candidate. Better to find another way to encode the rules that allows more flexibility. Benny replies to Andrew, it will be surprising to see org members or IETF breaking the bylaws, don't you think? If they do it, why are they members? Olivier, please do Istock have a position of an ombudsman? Olivier, I don't think so. Do you think that would help? Andrew says, the point I keep trying to make is that as a matter for bylaws, if this is a requirement for us to conform, then we need to have a remedy in the event the appointing bodies don't do it. If we don't have such a remedy, then we, the Internet Society, are breaking our own bylaws. Glenn McKnight says the ombudsman idea was brought up a few times in the past. Joel says, sorry, I'll wait for the translation there. Then he replies to Andrew, it is up to the ISOC lawyers to figure out the way forward, which will make ISOC not break its own bylaws. Olivier says +1. The translation of Joel's comment, we also need to consider youth representation. Andrew replies to Benny, yes, and I am asking this question to try and understand what possible instructions I could give to a lawyer. Richard Barnes replies to Benny, lawyers can't write bylaws if they're asked to encode contradictory requests. Nancy Reyes says we could help with digital accessibility compliance. Please write us nancy.rf@gmail.com. Bill Murdoch, as a not-for-profit First Nation corporation, our board includes one youth, 18 to 29 years of age, as a voting board member, plus an elder in a consultant capacity as needed. From my experience, having a youth, someone from the grassroots level on the board, helps keep everyone honest. Is the role of the board in the duty of ISOC? What about connecting the unconnected? How is open internet development done for a community that is not connected? In tech, the solution is always simple. The hard part is finding it. Solving the problem and ensuring the path to a solution is compliant, follows the rule, is legal, could be the role of a non-voting subject matter expert or special consultants. Peter says, how are you going to help us who are in Uganda as far as internet usage is concerned? Most of the people do not have access to the internet. And Glenn McKnight replies, Bill makes a good point about youth representation. George.
Thank you. I want to go back to the potential additional 3 members the board could provide by appointment. Is it required that the board, if it appointed such members, appoint them for a 3-year term? I understand the,
yes.
The lumpiness of it, but a small change would allow a term of 1 year or 2 years, and so you would not feel you were committing to a certain getting the distribution right for a longer period. I know that's in violation of the no bylaws changes, but it's a change that would allow that to become more, that strategy to become more palatable. Thank you.
So George, the key thing is the way the bylaws are currently written, it would be a 3-year term, and making such a change would require the usual process for changing the bylaws. But I'll point out that it also means that the churn problem that we've discussed in the board,
Right,
for having the number of board members change over time being very high for an organization like this, that makes it potentially worse unless one of the other constituencies, seeing the good work of the person who's put on for 1 or 2 years under this program, decides to make them an appointee through their own process. So it's definitely the case that if you do this in order to make the opportunity to make shorter term appointments, you're getting a side effect of a much higher potential churn. Going to the chat probably for the last time because we're beginning to run out of time. Laura Thompson asks, what's your org's definition of elder, Bill Murdoch? Penny replies to Andrew, I am sure that the lawyers can figure out ways to have diversity on the board from each group, org, IETF chapters. Should one of these groups not follow the bylaws, perhaps the Board of Trustees can appoint for that year a person from a different geography, gender, and by rejecting the candidates provided by the group, which is breaking the bylaws, it will send a signal back that this is not allowed. But again, I'm not a state of Virginia lawyer, so it's up to them to figure out the way forward. Victor Kaur Singh says, as a newer member, I have some more fundamental questions which I feel are important as we attempt to achieve needed diversity, but also measure the results of that diversity. Are we getting better? How to improve? Lee McKnight says, it is a solved problem to require nominating groups to only propose diverse slates that the NOMCOM may further push forward select from, keeping in mind that other constituencies have done. How exactly the slate is diverse will vary, of course. Arthur says, from my experience of reviewing Istock applications, I prefer an inclusion criteria that includes at least 2 criteria. For example, 1, knowledge of Istock's remit, 2, gender or youth, but also more importantly, another core skill such as being an educator who knows how Istock's work relates to a specific sector. Matsevi says, I would like to record an emphasis by an earlier speaker who said, not quoting exactly verbatim, my members should not want to be appointed to the board for status, but should be willing to add value and make time for the work of the organization. Stephen Farrell replies to Venny, I disagree that IETF can easily meet diversity requirements, and that's a reason not to hard code those in the bylaws. Dave Burstein says, Andrew and Ted are powerful members of IETF. They should use the respect they have to solve the substance. Andrew Sullivan says, replying to Lee, the NOMCOM doesn't make the appointments. The appointing bodies make them directly. The NOMCOM just produces a slate that the groups are suggested to vote from. The voting appointing bodies can add other people by petition. This is a good point. One of the things that the process currently allows is members to suggest either others or themselves and to put forward petitions to be part of the voting slate. And that means that you do get one important part of a diversity, that somebody who may have been completely ignored by the NOMCOM can put themselves forward and make a case to the larger community that they should be included. And I believe that that's been a valuable mechanism in the past. But it also means that the fundamental 2-stage structure of this may have a flaw in achieving the goal. So if we said that the NOMCOM itself must be diverse, and this is one of the things that's a recommendation from this that the board will certainly consider, and that the NOMCOM itself should consider putting forward the most diverse slate it can, and that's again something to consider. Then it remains up to the constituencies to consider whether the NOMCOM slates are the final slates, because the NOMCOM slate is the starting point and the petitions make the final slate, if there are any. And that final slate may or may not have the same characteristics as the NOMCOM slate. And of course, the final votes are still in the hands of the members of the different constituencies. I remind everybody before we close, though, that even though we talk about constituencies here in the selection process, once somebody's on the board, they are expected to represent ISOC's interest as a whole and to support the mission of ISOC whether it be carried forward by the IETF, carried forward by the organizational members, by the chapters, or by the organization. And the result of that is that everybody who is selected must have the understanding that their role will be, once selected, to put the duty to Istock above the duty to any constituency that put them in place. And that's an important point. We have come to the end of time. First, let me thank everybody who worked to bring us to this point. Once again, thank the Governance Reform Working Group and its chairs. Thank all of you who came today and made your time and interventions available to the board. We'll take them into account and have further discussions and bring back what we will do with this point and the upcoming set of issues around mechanisms for consultation back to the community as soon as we can. Thank you again.